Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about a legendary World War II aircraft, a single-engine fighter that at the end of its 20-plus year production run became the second most produced aircraft in World War II, and the third most produced aircraft ever, just behind the Soviet IL-2 and the Cessna 172. Yes, today we're talking about the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's main fighter aircraft in the Second World War. Back in the early to mid 1930s, not terribly long after the rise of the Nazi Party in 1933, as they had significant military ambitions across Europe and the rest of the world, frankly, the Luftwaffe, at this stage still technically not the Luftwaffe, due to Treaty of Versailles restrictions, but Germany was also training pilots in secret regardless, and the Reich Air Ministry sought to improve their current stable of fighter aircraft, which at the time consisted of a small smattering of biplanes, even though they technically weren't supposed to have fighter aircraft in the first place, but lying is very effective. To this aim, 4 aircraft companies would be issued contracts to produce new, more modern fighters. These companies were Heinkel, Arado, Focke-Wulf, and BFW. Of these 4 companies, BFW is definitely the lesser known of the 4, and it's much more well known by the name of Messerschmitt, which it changed to in 1938. At the time, part of the BFW team was Willy Messerschmitt, aircraft designer and Count Olaf lookalike, and he would be the principal designer in this competition, drawing mainly off a previous design in the M37, also known as the Bf 108. Messerschmitt and company would create their P1034 design, later designated the Bf 109. The Bf 109 was a low-wing monoplane powered at the time by a single Junkers Umo 210 that only had about 600 to 700 horsepower, with a cockpit canopy that blended quite well into the rear fuselage to create a rather sleek rear half of the plane. For its competitors, Arado would design the AR-80, also a low-wing monoplane powered by a 210. And generally they looked kinda similar, although the cockpit canopy on the AR-80 was more open and bubble-like than the Bf 109. Heinkel would design the HE-112, also a low-wing monoplane powered by a 210, but the 112 was a good bit larger than the Bf 109. And lastly, Focke-Wulf actually didn't have a low-wing monoplane for a change, and instead they had a high-wing, parasol-style monoplane in their FW-159 design, but it was also to be powered by a 210 though. Of these 4 designs, 2 of them quickly stood out as potential winners, while one of them was quickly found to have issues, and one of them realistically never stood a chance in the first place. The FW-159 design was just too old-fashioned, and it would lead to increased drag with that high wing. So even if it did end up performing well, the drag caused by that high wing would inevitably kill the design. Then the AR-80, while not bad on paper, suffered from excessive weight issues and thus poor performance. This would leave just the HE-112 and Bf 109. In the early stages of the prototype testing, the HE-112 was superior in performance, but the Bf 109 wasn't that far behind. This led to both planes being given contracts for 10 more models to be made for testing, and here in this additional testing, the Bf 109 would overtake and pull away from the 112. This was because on the initial prototypes, neither plane actually had the Umo 210 installed, but rather a Rolls-Royce Kestrel. When the 210s were finally ready and installed, the performance of the Bf 109 improved significantly, and because of this boost in performance, much to the surprise of many German pilots, the Bf 109 ended up winning the design competition, and in 1936, production of the Bf-109 would begin, and in early 1937, it was officially introduced to the Luftwaffe, now officially and publicly called the Luftwaffe. But instead of talking about the many variants of the Bf-109 and its performance in combat throughout the war, etc., all of that can be its own video at some point in the future. Instead, I want to bring up a different point. Why didn't there seem to be an heir to the Bf-109? Past the FW-190 that was first flown in mid-1939, the FW-190 was more partner than successor, and other than the many variants of the Bf-109, it didn't really have a successor aircraft until maybe the ME-262, and even then it's kinda hard to call the 262 a successor considering its total production run. So why exactly wasn't there a successor for a plane that was designed in the mid-30s? Was the Bf-109 just that good, or was there something else going on? To spoil the answer, it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. The Bf-109 did actually have successors, direct successors made by Messerschmitt in the same sort of familial line. And yet, after several attempts, nothing would successfully replace the World War II legend. It's these attempted replacement planes that I want to focus on today to see why all of them failed. This is the Messerschmitt Me-209 and Me-309, with guest appearances from the 409, 509, and 609. But first, to get this little inconsistency out of the way, we have the name of these planes. Why was the Bf-109 the Bf-109, and the successors the ME? It's actually pretty simple. When the Bf-109 was made, the company was BFW. In 1938, Willy Messerschmitt became chairman and director of BFW, and the company name was then changed to Messerschmitt. As the other planes were made after 1938, they would then have the name of ME. So with that out of the way, for the first several years of the Bf-109's career in the late 30s pre-World War II, things were pretty smooth sailing. While not being produced in significant numbers just yet, 109As, Bs, Cs, and Ds, all sporting the UMO 210 engine, helped to fill out the Luftwaffe and bring some extra firepower to German-aligned forces in the Spanish Civil War. Each successive variant would bring some greater firepower, and starting with the 109E, a bigger and stronger engine in the DB601. However, at least over at Messerschmitt, there were some inklings that the Bf-109 would need some major improvements to factors like speed and firepower, which could be improved upon in the Bf-109, but likely only by so much on the same frame. At some point, a new design, a new frame has to be made, and to head off a seemingly anticipated drop-off, Messerschmitt decided to design a successor plane that would have some new bells and whistles, along with just generally improved performance in the Me-309. Now, we'll get to the 209 in a little bit, but funnily enough, the first proposed successor to the 109 was the 309, or at the very least the first serious proposed successor. By 1940, with the phony war over, and Germany actually engaging in combat with French and British fighters, or at least serious combat, and some British fighters proving to be a relative match for the Bf-109Es and Fs, Messerschmitt would begin work on a potential successor. As the designation Me-209 was currently occupied, the new design in the Me-309 was to be a low-wing monoplane, powered by a single Daimler-Benz DB603 engine, with over 1,700 horsepower, a significant boost over the 1100 or so horsepower of the DB601. The 309 was also to feature tricycle landing gear, very thin wings, retractable ventral radiators to decrease drag, a bubble-style canopy, and a pressurized cockpit, measuring in at 9.46 meters long, 11.04 meters wide, and 3.9 meters tall. The ME-309 was all around larger than the Bf-109, and was on average to carry a stronger armament. The basic armament was to be a single 20mm cannon and two 13mm machine guns, and there was also a heavy fighter variant that was to have three 20mm cannons and four 13mm machine guns. As the initial designing was underway, the Battle of Britain in mid to late 1940 would end up adding another proposed improvement to the 309 design. In that battle, a major issue would afflict the Bf-109. While they were the more optimal aircraft to combat the Spitfires and Hurricanes that were flying over Britain and destroying German bombers, the Bf-109 just didn't have the range capable of actually escorting those bombers and remaining over Britain to take out British fighters. Larger aircraft like the Bf-110 could do that, but they just weren't agile enough. Drop tanks likely could be added to the Bf-109 to increase range, but they also increased drag and reduced performance. This would show Messerschmitt that Germany needed an aircraft with greater range sans drop tanks, and so the ME-309 was ideally to have much greater internal fuel storage, along with the possibility of further increasing fuel capacity through drop tanks. At minimum, without the drop tanks, the range of the 309 was to be over 800 miles. To put it in the context of the Battle of Britain, if the German planes were taking off from Dunkirk and attacking London, that distance was 112 miles one way, 224 miles both ways. So with just over a quarter of a fuel tank, the 309 could make it there and back, and likely with a bit over half a tank it could fly bomber escort or combat missions over London and back. Now, while these specs were certainly enticing, the greater engine power, greater armament, and more fuel, the Reich Air Ministry just wasn't interested in the 309, nor were they all that interested in a successor to the 109 in general. This was likely twofold. For one, the then head of Luftwaffe aircraft production, Erhard Milch, believed that production should be more centralized and lacking in variety. This in turn would prioritize multi-role aircraft that could be easily modified, and your tried and true planes. So planes like the Ju-88 and Bf-110 and the Bf-109 that prove that it could easily handle modifications, weapon alterations, and new engines with rather little issue. So with that in mind, why exactly would Milch want to move away from making the Bf-109? If it was performing poorly, then sure, but for two, aside from the Battle of Britain, where German aircraft of all manner struggled in some regard, the Bf-109 was performing quite well, and so there was no immediate need to try and replace it. So this meant that the 309 project didn't receive all that much attention or funding, and while it did receive an order for 9 or 10 prototypes, the project was assigned a low priority, and it wasn't until late June 1942 that the first prototype was ready. But before even flying, a taxiing test showed that the 309 swayed when it tried to travel straight, and the nose wheel wobbled. This meant that there would have to be some alterations to both the tail and nose wheel before flight. After roughly a 3-week delay, on July 18, 1942, the 309 would take to the air, for all of 7 minutes due to engine cooling issues. This was caused by, of all things, the landing gear, as the nose wheel retracted too slowly and blocked airflow to the oil cooling radiator for too long, thus causing the issue. This was quickly remedied by increasing hydraulic pressure on the nose wheel, making it retract faster. However, this was far from the only issue of the 309, and more alterations to the engine cowling, tail, and control surfaces had to be made in an effort to improve upon its remarkably poor stability and control. And even with these alterations, test pilots still remarked that the plane was generally difficult to control, and overall it was just unpleasant. All of these issues could be overlooked, though, if the potential combat performance was good enough. And while the 309 did offer some improvements over the 109s that were in service, it was also worse in some regards. The top speed at high altitudes was excellent, upwards of 455 miles an hour, but at lower altitudes, the top speed was only noted to be about 30 miles an hour faster than the Bf 109. An improvement, sure, but the problem here was that the increase in size and weight and power ended up bringing a decrease in agility, and the Bf 109 was far more agile than the Me 309. The 309 could win in a drag race, but would be disadvantaged in an actual dogfight. So overall, there would be no real benefit in producing the 309 over the 109. And so accordingly, with production being centralized around a handful of designs, the original order for 9 or 10 prototypes was reduced down to just 4, and the 309 would live out the rest of its days more as a testbed plane, with the later prototypes being equipped with lower-powered DB605 engines, and by mid-1943, the 309 project was effectively dead. It did seem as though Messerschmitt had confidence that the 309 would succeed, though, and during its initial designing and testing, the 309, at least by proxy, would be thrown into a different design request for a destroyer aircraft in 1941, and in an interesting move, 2 309 frames would be bolted together, in effect, to create a single plane in the Me-609, a plane quite similar to the HE-111Z made in 1941 and the F-82 Twin Mustang, first flown near the end of World War II. While certainly quite interesting, the 609 was only a concept plane and advanced no further than the drawing board. So, even though the 309 was a flop, this didn't actually dissuade Messerschmitt from hatching a new plan to replace the Bf 109, and this new plan involved largely using 109 components to create a better aircraft. This new plane would be the Me 209. But why did the 209 come after the 309? Well, it was a weird little series of events. You see, in 1937-38, not as a fighter project, Messerschmitt would design and create the Me-209. While this too was a low-wing monoplane aircraft, it wasn't to be a military aircraft of any kind, but rather a record-setting plane built purely to break the top speed record. To this end, Messerschmitt would construct a small plane powered by a very powerful variant of the DB601 engine, with up to 2,300 horsepower. Now, this plane too could be its own video, but to keep it brief for right now, the initial Me-209 was successful in setting a new record for top speed on April 26, 1939, hitting 469 miles an hour. And due to its name being similar to the Bf 109, it ended up being used for propaganda purposes, to promote an alleged German fighter that had hit 469 miles an hour. In reality, though, while Messerschmitt would attempt to make it into a fighter aircraft, it was never a serious contender, and thus it would end up lying largely dormant past 1940. So, as the name and the plane had been lying dormant for several years, when Messerschmitt was designing another proposed successor in 1943, the name of the ME-209 was then transferred over to this new project. And to separate the two, the 1943 project is more commonly known as the ME-209-2. At least conceptually speaking, I think the 209-2 did have a better shot of being a successor, since it was largely to use 109 parts, parts that were already in production. Relatively little would have to be done to shift factory production from the 109 to the 209-2. This would hopefully satisfy the Erhard-Milch aspect of aircraft production. But rather quickly, this initial plan began to change. Initially, it was planned to largely use the Bf-109G fuselage and wings, with larger tail surfaces and a reworked engine compartment, for the planned DB603 engine. While the DB603 was an inline liquid-cooled engine, the 209-2 was to utilize an annular radiator, giving it the appearance of a radial engine. In some initial wind tunnel testing, it was found that with the modifications being made to the rest of the plane, the 109G wings weren't the proper size, and thus new, longer wings would have to be custom made, taking away some of that ease of production selling point that the plane had. But regardless of this new change, prototype production would continue. Measuring 9.74 meters long, 10.95 meters wide, and 4 meters tall, the 209-2 was overall larger than the Bf-109 as well, and roughly the same size as the 309. The 209-2 would retain the same general fuselage shape of the 109, ditching the bubble canopy of the 309, and largely the 209-2 looked like just a larger 109 with a bigger and pointier tail section. The armament would be about on par with your average 109G, with at least a single 20 or 30 mil cannon firing centrally and two 13 mil machine guns in the wing roots. First flying in November 1943, the performance of the 209-2 was actually quite solid, and offered a relatively decent boost over your standard 109G, with a top speed at about 20,000 feet, sitting at 410 miles an hour, and with a power-boosting nitrous system, that speed could be increased upwards of 458. During prototype testing and construction, the engine would end up being switched over to the UMO 213, with similar power to the DB603, and so these later 209-2 prototypes had similar performance. With such solid performance at this stage of the war, the main competition for the 209-2 would be both the late model 109Gs and the FW-190, specifically the 190D. While better than the Bf-109s, the 209-2 was roughly equal to the 190D in performance, although the 190D was about 16 miles an hour faster at 20,000 feet. So ultimately it came down to production logistics. Between the 190D and 209-2, which one of these was easier to produce? Which one would lead to less production line disruptions? And due to the alterations that had to be made to the 209-2 to make it work properly, the answer was the 190D, and so then the 209-2 also ended in failure. Past the 209-2, there were two more propeller-powered fighter projects that seemed to be part of this general line, that I could also find very little information on other than some artist renderings. There was the ME-409, and that was apparently to be in the destroyer role like the 609, and would combine two 209-2 frames into one. But it is also possible that this project was supposed to be a high-altitude interceptor, and then the project was succeeded by Blom and Voss with their BV-155 design. Regardless of what the 409 project actually was, it went nowhere. And lastly, there was the ME509, which was supposed to be a pretty severe departure from the rest of the '09 designs, with the cockpit being mounted on the nose. The design bore a striking resemblance to the Japanese Yokosuka R2Y, and because of this, it is certainly possible that Japan got the idea of this design from Germany, or vice versa. However, this has never been confirmed, and it might just be a really weird coincidence. But ultimately, though, because of the multiple failures to replace the Bf-109, it would end up reigning supreme as Germany's most produced plane during the war. Quite simply, the Bf-109 just took too well to being adapted, and fit with new engines and guns and whatnot. It was too versatile, too willing to be altered and improved. And because Germany wanted to keep their production lines clean and uniform, this was insanely valuable, unless there could be some massive boost in performance, like with the Me-262 jet fighter, then just producing tons and tons of Bf-109s would certainly suffice. It's actually kinda similar to America and their tank designs, making tons of Shermans that were technologically inferior to a number of German tanks, individually weaker as well, but the fact that they could just make a ton of them and make them pretty easily was a major benefit. Sometimes a horde of just solid weapons is better than a decently large group of great weapons. Quantity, especially in a time of mass mobilization, is often better than quality, and for planes like the Me-209 and 309, they stood little chance against a plane like the Bf-109, that generally actually had both of these. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, you know what I started getting into recently again because I'm just a massive dweeb? Yu-Gi-Oh! There's that Legacy of the Duelist game. I have it on PS4, and I started playing it again, and it's just very fun. I loved Yu-Gi-Oh! When I was a kid, so it's very nostalgic for me. I used to have this massive box of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards down in my closet, and then when I turned like 13 or something like that, my mom asked me if I wanted them anymore, and because I was a dumb kid, I said no. And I really wish I hadn't done that and then thrown them all away. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.